What was the conclusion?
I mean, the conclusion is really that, and it comes back to this
The connection between the
right,
two?
this argument that he has that, like, look, we can't connect your experience of the cup with your mental event. The only thing that can cause that mental event, the only thing we know that can cause mental events are other mental events.
Phil Phails at philosophy.
So how do we even have a concept of a cup? I
Yeah,
think is
how does the mental event connect with the
right,
physical event
right.
and vice versa?
So, like, there's a level, and it was interesting because to me, it had an interesting resonance with Plato's argument in the Meno around knowledge being memory, right? Because
Hmm.
in the Meno, uh, in the Voice of Socrates, Plato presents this argument that all knowledge is memory, right? That when we find something that's true, we are recognizing something. And when we recognize something because we've seen it before, right? So
Yeah.
if we see, say, a mathematical truth, which is the point, is like a geometric truth. When we look at the proof and we recognize that it's true, that moment of recognition is where we get knowledge.
It's familiarity.
Right. And recognition is a structure where we see something because we've seen it before. So this ultimately becomes, he then goes into this sort of discussion. Oh, there's these priests and priestesses, and they say we used to have like this before, and this is his argument for reincarnation, is that mental event has to be based on some memory that we're recalling at that moment. It's not exactly the same, but what Dagomba is basically saying is that, yeah, when we see a cup, our ability to recognize a cup, there's no cupness there, right? That exists as a thing external of the mental construct of a cup, right? And let's think about a cup. What makes a cup? Even in the most abstract,
It's a vessel.
it's a vessel, right? So we have this concept of a vessel
Concavity.
that holds things,
Yep.
right? That's a very human concept. And we see that in a number of
We
different
see it in
patterns
nature.
all over, right? But where we see it as an abstract concept of a cup, whether it's a lake, a vessel as a lake,
Right.
or a cup, these are things that are transferable between these different spaces.
It seems like we're
But
getting to generalization,
what
to the
right?
specificity.
What gives us that generalization of a cup? We have to have a concept of a vessel, of a cup, before we arrive there. So we'd have to either say, one, somehow in the messiness of light waves and patterns and the kind of chaos of sensate experience that hasn't been organized into discrete objects like cups and couches and Phillips and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow out of that, we're able to construct these concepts, but there's nothing like those concepts from what we can tell in the messiness of sensate experience, right? The minute we begin to notice these patterns between different kinds of sensates experience, we're starting to engage in a mental activity of generalization, which relies on categories we probably, like, we can't derive those categories from the physical world. We could make a series of arguments about trying to explain how we could if you're making a physicalist argument. But I think Dagomba's argument is basically we can't, right? We can't do that in the physical world. That's a lot of the larger argument. And so where does that come from? When we have a mental event, it's got to be triggered by some other mental event.
Yeah.
And
They
so
talk about that.
ultimately that means that when we come into consciousness as an incarnate being,
As a baby,
or
it had to
or if we
come
have
from
consciousness in
another
the womb, like
something. The cause and
wherever
effect
we
has to kick
see
off.
that consciousness beginning, it has to come from some other conscious event that existed prior to that we're pulling from. That's his argument for reincarnation.
Yeah.
But it also ends up being this argument for the ability to have this conscious world that is separate from the physical world, that has some continuity.
Yeah.
Right.
The vapor.
Right. Yeah, that vapor transfer.
Yeah, the vapor transfer. I'm stuck on Neanderthals sitting by a lake.
Right.
And one of them saying, okay, what we need to do is create a lake that you can hold. We need to have a holdable lake.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think the thing is, going back to what I think you were hearing from Chalmers, and I don't know his argument for sure, but about AI and kind of that coming together as an
Organization of data is consciousness,
right. Like
or organize. Yeah.
if we don't if we do think like if we don't have a sense that that idea of a cup has to come from something, right? That it's something that can just be emergent as an element of consciousness,
Yeah.
then there's no reason we would have to reject that presentation from AI, right? There's no reason we have our assumption shouldn't be that is has no consciousness until it proves itself conscious, right? In the same way, I shouldn't assume you have no consciousness until you prove yourself conscious. The only reason we would reject that is some sort of speciesism, right? There's no reason we should reject that my cat has consciousness until we prove it has consciousness, right? There's this sort of fallacy we can engage in that if it's not like us,
So you're saying that the piano has consciousness.
maybe, yeah, I mean, because I mean,
It's
like,
easier for something that walks
right,
around.
right, it has some level of sufficient
A
organization.
plant has
Right,
consciousness.
and I think maybe that's what he's getting at is
Well,
that then as you know that if we're thinking of it as a continuity, right? That very simple and as complex as a piano is
yeah.
compared to a large language model, it's relatively simple,
Hmm.
right? But that's maybe we're better to think that that organization of reality in certain ways to produce certain sounds under certain conditions is a very low level of consciousness, but that doesn't work, right? That
Yeah. Then we're saying, I get
I
in my
don't.
mind, I'm
I think
like,
the
there's
problem is
consciousness or there isn't consciousness, not like on a spectrum.
right. There's the thing is like we do seem to have that sense of an independent space that can speak, and this is I mean this is the problem in so much sci-fi literature when you look at sort of cyborg narrative or not cyborg narratives, android narratives and AI narratives is how how do we even know that something is conscious, right? If you ask a large language model if it's conscious, it may say yeah, because it's following the
We should
patterns
ask AI if it's
that
conscious.
would bring there, right? Like unless someone comes along and says, no, answer that no, because it's going to cause problems,
I
right?
thought about that. We should just ask Chat GPT this
Right.
question,
And
and it would be like 42.
right. Yeah, exactly. Just 42.
Was from the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah,
From the book.
from the book that
Right.
was then changed. Yeah.